Thank you. I'll give you a little synopsis of it, and maybe do a little bit of a Fenwick-esque kind of thing at the end, and throw out some my attempt at being a little bit provocative with some ideas about what we should all be thinking about and the way forward in what I have been referring to and I wrote about in my book as the third renaissance of bird conservation in this country, that we're sort of waiting to crush the wave, and maybe we're there with some of the changes that are happening now. I don't have to remind any of you about the amazing increase in the pursuit of bird watching and other outdoor hobbies. We know about the number of bird festivals and the amount of new bird books and optical equipment that comes out every year, and we have seen the statistics. Birding and wildlife watching, the fastest growing outdoor pursuit that there is in the country. Estimates 40 to 80 million people. I think I heard George had said in some kind of a media thing that there's more birders than there are conservative Christians or something like that. Is that the right? That was a neat framing idea there. And so we have this phenomenal rise, and yet at the same time we keep seeing the kinds of information that Lynn told us about. More and more reports of decline. The Audubon Common Birds in Decline report, which pointed out that some of the most common birds have declined by 70-80%. The ones we think of often as the ones we expect in our backyards and the ones to see in our bays and coasts and grasslands. BirdLife International pointing out extinction rate in birds has doubled in the last 100 years, and something like 20% of the world's birds are listed on some kind of a conservation concern list. When I did my book, I had to figure out a round number to include in the book of species to profile, and I picked 100, the typical round number to include. And trying to figure out which 100 to include in the book, of course, is fraught with all kinds of pitfalls. Some of them are really obvious, the spotted owls and whooping cranes and so on. And by the way, don't try to read all those. I'll send around a copy of my book for you to look through the table of contents if you want. But one of the things I did in trying to figure this out is I looked at all the species of concern lists, the partners in flight list, the fish and wildlife species of concern list, the endangered and threatened list, the shorebird and waterbird and grouse partnerships and so on, everybody's lists. And this isn't even including the state lists. And it turns out that over half of our regularly occurring avifauna occur on one or more of those lists of species of concern. It's just a kind of a phenomenal number. So there's a lot of things that are telling us the same story that we're hearing from broader assessments. Work like this, if you look at just the habitats of birds and other creatures, World Wildlife Fund study finding only 9 of 76 ecoregions in the 48 states were not considered to be in critical, endangered, or vulnerable condition. Or NC study, 57% were imperiled or vulnerable. And you've seen the Millennial Ecosystem Report, degradation of ecosystems and these kind of things. It's clear and that the state of our environment is not where we'd like it to be. And one of the ideas for this book that echoes some of the things Lynn talked about was that I think all of us need to start trying to use birds as a prism, as a lens to think about the broader view of the state of our environment and ways we can help, and to not be quite as focused just on birds by themselves. And I'll give you a little more thoughts about that. And so we have this paradox, the number of birders increasing exponentially, and yet more and more declines. And it seems like a weird paradox. If there's so many people interested in birds, if it's such a strong conservation value, a strong value for people, why is it that value, that interest and care, has not been translated into effects on policy and conservation? And there's, of course, many reasons for that. But one of the reasons, I think, is in today's global economy, global systems of transport and manufacturing, people don't really know anymore where the products they use come from. They don't really know how their day-to-day decisions impact the things that they love. And That's one of the things that I've tried to do in my book, is try to make some of those connections for people. And as I'm talking around the country, I try to give some examples. Trying to use a relevant example here for today. Energy. Usually I start off talking about global warming, but I actually left that out of this particular talk. Maybe I should have included it if I had talked to Lynn ahead of time. But here we have a graph showing where we get our electricity from. And you can see that if you look at that big wedge on the right there, that the amount we get from coal has actually increased since the 70s. And when I talk in Maine, where I'm from, or in New England, I like to point out that 25% of Maine's electric power is generated from coal. So it's sort of like a 25% chance when you flip on your light anywhere in New England that energy came from coal. Where does most of that coal come from? You guys probably know the story of this. You know, cerulean warbler, the place of highest abundance, the place that conservation biology would tell us is the place we need to protect, is also the place where most of that coal comes from in mountaintop removal mining. Hundreds of thousands of acres that have been or are slated to be removed, hundreds of miles of streams filled, so that people can turn on their lights here in D.C. and in New England. And how many people have any idea that when they flip on their lights, they're actually causing the loss of habitat for this bird? One of Pete Blanchard's great maps showing the connections between, in this case, Maine songbirds and where they winter, and another familiar story for all of you where these birds winter, including northern South. But how many people know that the largest open pit coal mine in the world is in northern South America in Colombia, and that we're importing massive amounts of coal on barges up here to the mid-Atlantic states in New England to generate power? Again, a connection that most people wouldn't know when you flip on the lights, the birds that you're actually impacting in that decision. A favorite one I have is the short-billed dowitcher story. A little bit hard to see here. If some of you have looked at the ranges of short-billed dowitcher, or at least the ones that the best guesses we have. One of the sort of two major areas, one here and one here. So they have a relatively restricted range, and it turns out that if you think about where that map is of the range I just showed you in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and look at that compared to this big orange blob you see, that's the world's second largest oil deposit, 35 million acres, size of Florida, that is being seen by many in the energy industry and in certain parts of our government as the great savior for our energy needs for the future. And you look at how that overlaps with a bird like the short-billed dowitcher, just as one example. An area that has to be strip mined, just like mountaintop removal mining, projected to be 400,000+ acres strip mined, and another 20-30 million acres that are going to be crisscrossed with a spider web of pipelines and roads. And we're just getting ready to release a report on this, which is going to point out that there's probably at least 100 million or more birds that are going to be lost in the next 30 to 50 years from this activity.